Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of this series on ethos that we've developed here at Massive. As a reminder, ethos is a term that we've created for essentially what it takes to be a conscious brand and to do conscious branding and marketing. And so, what we're doing with this series of ethos is we're breaking down the various components. Last time it was about a school of philosophy, and today it's about brand poetry. Now, brand poetry is a term that I came up with, I don't know, a couple years ago to describe the process of how I go about helping a brand craft their language. And it really requires a level of consciousness to use brand poetry. And I'll explain more about that in a little bit. So, most brands range from boring to cheesy to creepy. And this is partially a lack of awareness. They just don't know. And it's partially laziness. But it's also something else, which I'll share more about in a minute. A conscious brand knows that the language drives everything. And so there's much more intentionality in crafting it of what I call brand poetry. Now, a lot of brand language ends up, tasting like day old oatmeal, or it's cringeworthy, like a dad using modern language, which I love to do with my youngest son, Andre, who's 14, to use modern language. And uh, I can't tell if he's impressed by my knowledge of modern slang, or he's only cringy. It's hard to tell. But a lot of brands sound like that. Like a word has become a cliche when bigger brands use it, like the word bling, for example. That was cool for a while, but then as soon as marketing started using it, it became not cool. Really, what we're talking about here are brands sounding like Ferris Bueller's teacher. Bueller, that dry, boring voice, or Michael Scott from The Office, the king of not just cliches, but misquoted cliches and awkwardness, and again, cringy. And then sometimes brands sound like the Karen of the month. They're just yelly in their tone. And what this has created is not just brands that are boring, but it's actually created like a vacuum of creativity, that or black hole that brands are being sucked into. As I mentioned, this cocktail of lethargy comes from ignorance and indolence, or it comes from just being languid or not caring, apathy. And that's partially because it's just easier in the pressure of modern marketing to use the same stuff. You just get it shipped, get it done. But language is a sacred relic. It needs to be polished and gleamed until it's gleaming with like purpose and dripping with reverence. Like there's a process there that so many brands are unwilling to do. As I often say, brands want White Claw when really it takes bourbon. You're distilling bourbon, not making White Claw. I think it's curious too, is that back in the day when boots last longer than most marriages, brands like Red Wing or Stetson or Filson and many others weren't just slinging products. They were weaving narratives. And part of the reason they were able to do that is they tapped into a resource of young and up and coming authors. So in the late 1900s up and through the early 1900s up until World War II, essentially pre-mass media, that the copy is so good, and partially because some of it was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald, or later on Salman Rushdie or James Patterson, both in the 70s, got their start writing marketing copy. And because of that, they honed their craft on this millstone of marketing, and they used that as an opportunity not just to grow as writers, but the brand used it to tell these compelling stories in a very compact way. It's important to note that the language of a brand is really reflective of its level of consciousness. And I talked about this quite a bit in the first kickoff session of this Ethos series. But conscious brands help you speak in eloquent, clear, and artistic language. If you're a lower conscious brand, you go back into, like I said, boring, creepy, cheesy. So what separates and what broadens a brand's lexicon? Well, it is consciousness, but it's more than just consciousness. It's the ability, it's a skill on top of it. So you can be a conscious brand, you've done the inner work. There's a collective, a sense of collective intelligence in your organization. You can have done all that, but if you don't have the skill of poetry, then it's consciousness is not enough. Let's just put it that way. So the reason I use the word poetry, and then I'm going to get into the main bulk of our content today, is the main reason I use poetry is as this example is it is known for its brevity, its punch, its ability to squeeze the infinite into a droplet of ink. Is to take one or two words and create such gravitas and depth that it leaves a mark in your psyche. It's a kind of linguistic alchemy, poetry is. And it can take the most mundane things and turn them into sublime or unique or provocative. And so brand poetry borrows from this sort of blending of science and wizardry and to ethically enchant the minds of an audience and create these emotional bonds that transcend the transactional. So we're taking that best part of poetry. And the other thing about it is that we are taking, poetry in its essence is an ability, its power is ability to distill complexity of emotions and experiences and ideas into this, like I said, concise or evocative language. And, they use rhythm and rhyme to create resonance. And that creates a spiritual connection with the audience that opens both their mind and their heart. So the goal here is to figure out how to do this. And I think we need to start with how we got here. Now, I touched on this in the last session and in the article that I wrote after the session called Blame It on Bernays. But mass media kills language. And there's a couple of reasons for it. And the reason I bring this up is that it's important to know the world that you're playing in if you're going to try to create brand poetry for your brand, whether that's just you or a large organization. And so the first thing that you're dealing with is content proliferation. Now, I love the fact that, way back in the day with movable type was one of the first blogging platforms. And to now things like, Substack and Medium, and of course the social media platforms and email marketing platforms. There was this ability to create mass amounts of content. So that's one thing. Another area that is the result of mass media killing language is that the market is so fractional now. It's so fractionalized. And I've used this joke before, but it's still true, is the only predictable demographics are old people and Trump supporters. And that's not a political statement. It's an observation that there's just everyone else is very fragmented. And so you have this collision of content proliferation blended with marketing automation, especially during the pandemic, where many, many businesses invested in, CRMs and whatnot. What that's resulted in is an algorithm-based sort of language. And we're going to break that down in a little bit, but it's not like there's the motivation to use different language because there's so much language that's algorithm based that we subconsciously borrow from it. We find comfort in using the same metaphors and same quotes and things like that. And I like to turn this very common quote that was originally a brilliant, but turn it into, I guess, a little bit of humor. Is a lot of people, quote Einstein's definition of insanity. It's the same, it's doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result. And my version of that is, it is insanity to use the same language as everybody else and hope to be different. But that's what's happening. And then, as I mentioned, Bernays, Freud's nephew, a lot of his teachings still permeate branding and marketing language, which is really about persuasion, coercion, manipulation. Now, I think in this particular area, AI is actually going to make things better, because AI is really good at turning, especially ChatGPT, of turning like boring topics into things that are more provocative. And it also allows you to do more, like if you're doing more technical writing or academic writing, that you can focus on developing the story, and AI can focus on, finding the quotes or the, sources or citations, etc. And I think that's going to produce better language, brand language over time, but not anytime soon. So that's the world you're in. You're trying to build a brand. You're trying to develop a brand language, a brand poetry in a very paradoxically noisy, but sameness world. So the next thing I want to cover is it's like, how do you do this then? How do you find your muse? And this thing about the muse is the best poets and writers and creatives in general, they have a deep connection to their soul. They use stillness and blank space and silence to listen, and then they write down what they hear. And in the business world, the idea of being still and silent and having blank space and just letting it come to you, letting it arrive to you, don't force it, that is so foreign, because there's deadlines and you got a million things on your task list. But again, if you want to write brand poetry, you've got to slow down to think about what you want to say, to listen to your soul, your heart, the universe, or whatever, and get that download. Now, here's the thing. We all have an inner muse. Every human does, and it's called intuition. Now, intuition is not instinct. Instinct is about survival. So instinct in marketing language is the instinct to use the same language as everyone else because it feels like you're fitting in. It's safe and comfortable. But intuition is about things that are uniquely different. They're messages for you to share. They're insights for you to use and share. They're teachings that you can pass on. So this intuition is accessed, if we get into more of a spiritual concept here, by creating more harmony between the masculine energy and the feminine energy within inside of ourselves. So masculine energy is very linear, literal, logical, straight lines. Feminine energy uses the language that is more spherical. It's more poetic. And that's because it's based off of intuition, where masculine energy often is based off of instinct. And it sounds a bit woo-woo, but there's something there related to harmonizing those two sides within ourselves and within, a larger organization. And again, I'm not talking about gender, I'm talking about energy. So one of the things besides stillness and blank space and all that is that you have to activate the muse. You have to kind of let go of attachments to language that you've always used, even if you like it. But it's that really slowing down to be deliberate and letting go and say, I'm going to erase this. I'm going to allow my mind to open to other ideas. And the way you do that is you kind of turn down your left brain, your logical brain, and turn up your heart and listen much more to your body and your emotions than your thoughts when it comes to finding your muse. So your audience can be a muse as well, especially if conscious brands attract conscious people, and you can tap into their collective intelligence. But we got to be careful here, is it's a fine line between, saying what you want to say and seeing how the audience responds and listening to their response and giving them what they want to hear. There's a fine line there. As Coach Chris Peterson, former coach at Boise State and University of Washington, said, when you listen to the fans, you end up sitting with them. And there's an element there too. Rick Rubin talks about this as well, that if you start to make it for them, then it's no longer art. If you are informed by them, informed by their feedback and input, you can learn from that. So one of the great exercises here to tap into this collective intelligence of your audience as a muse is to ask a survey and just simply say, what would be the top 3 adjectives that you would use to describe me or our brand? And that's going to be helpful in a lot of ways, because collectively, a group of people are going to give you much more originality, but they're also going to show, where sameness pops up. And that'll be important in the next thing we're going to be doing here. So you found your inner muse when you feel the words in your body, you feel the language in your body, when you have your own like limbic response. And that's like you get like goose pimples, or your hair on the neck goes back up, or your heart races, or you get the shivers. Those are all limbic responses to things that are unexpected. It's your nervous system saying, pay attention. So if you don't feel that, and it's your words, your audience certainly will not. At best, they will give you sort of temporary attention and maybe a little bit of interaction, but they're not going to connect with you. So you do this by making the world react to you. You let them feel the weight of their words instead. And then you'll hear it, because they'll say things like, I've never thought about it that way before, or wow, that's compelling. You'll also hear this, and this is evidence, is I hate what you're saying, some variation of that. If people hate what you're saying, then that means that there are going to be people that love what you say. And that apathetic or insipid, thin language is appealing to no one. Your brand becomes kind of like miso soup at that point. Now, I know some people like miso soup, but it's still not the most interesting thing to eat. So the next area is a fun game that I call bullshit bingo. And so bullshit bingo is just like it sounds, in the sense of creating a bingo card, 5 rows, 5 columns, and you get 25 spaces. And if you want your own bingo card to use, just DM me your email and I will send you one, a branded bullshit bingo card. So then what you do is you can look up the top 25 overused words or terms in your industry, with your competition, or in your community. And you can get ChatGPT to help you here. You just say, what are the top 5 buzzwords in my industry, and whatever that is. And you pick your industry, whether it's coaching or accounting or manufacturing or software, and you find out what ChatGPT says. But you can also just look into what your competitors are saying, because that's a useful exercise too. So as I said, these are buzzwords, they're cliches, they're trendy words, they're jargon, they're trope. In other words, they're bullshit. So now this is the real challenge. And this is especially fun to do with an executive team, is you take your bingo card when you have it all filled out, and you go through all of the human facing language in your brand, your website, your marketing materials, your sales proposals, your press releases, your product marketing, your recruiting language, your customer experience language, all of that. And you play bullshit bingo. And, there are certain words that are still useful. So it's not like you can't have any of the words in your grid, but if you could play bingo, if you can get 5 across, then, I guarantee you it's going to be more than 5 buzzwords. It's going to exponentially be more, because it's a habit, like I said. So have fun playing bullshit bingo. Be like brutally honest with yourself when you go through, especially web copy, and social media presence. And that's just because the attention span is even shorter for that type of content. So the next thing is that I want to share is how important diversity is here. So boring language is the result of sameness. When they were younger, and like in their teens, I told my sons Logan and Caden that if they ended up being around people who look the same, talk the same, behave the same, they're either in a cult or they've joined a large organization. And it's that sameness within the culture that comes from what I call, rather directly, white people language. So it comes from certain power structures. And what's interesting about this, that boring language is the privilege of having power or having a huge marketing budget, because you could just hammer the same thing over and over again. So it's not just about laziness. There's a power play or a blind spot due to power in here as well. If you are used to making people listen like you can through a force, there's no motivation for the language to be interesting on your part. So what diversity does, though, if you don't want to do that, diversity is accessing the language of your brand through the collective intelligence of those who are part of your brand, of understanding that everyone has, beyond even their social labels, they have various experiences and backgrounds, and they have their own voice. And if you're tapping into that, you start to see that your audience is going to tell you, show you through their diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of social labels, that a language will emerge from that. And there's other areas of diversity too. Like I said, diversities of thought, where people that just think differently, or diversities of background. There's a big difference between, for example, the language of people that grew up rural and the language of people that grew up in the suburbs. And so you can learn from all of that. And of course, you tap into your own background, your own backstory. That goes into, it has to be emotional for you. And it's interesting too, is you can also look at like behavioral profiles, like DISC or Enneagram. And I know that BMW uses the Enneagram and writes the language of their marketing copy and their user manual to appeal to all 9 Enneagram types. It's really fascinating. Once you pick up a BMW or owner's manual, if you know anything about the Enneagram, you can really break it down. And they're not the only brands that do that, but that's its own kind of diversity. And then, of course, there's neurodiversity. I used to say, assume that everyone that you're trying to talk to is consuming something else and also has ADHD or ADD. And there's, I'm sort of joking with that, but I think the best thing to do is actually start with language that's appealing to a neurodivergent person, because the neurotypicals will figure it out. And if you get the neurotypicals to feel emotion and get their attention, then you're going to get, if you're going to get neurodivergence attention, you're going to get neurotypical people's attention as well. So what we're trying to break through here with diversity is we're trying to create kind of a preventative from having to play bullshit bingo. But really, it boils down to the last thing that I wanted to share. It boils down to the first 15 seconds. And think about this. Earning someone's choice or attention is a privilege, but it's also a choice for you. So one path you could take is to leverage their attention to manipulate them. That's what clickbait is, for example, or overly clever one-liners. They're designed to capture attention and then, lead them around by the nose to create the behavior that they want. Or you can do the ethical thing and harness their attention to enchant their imagination and stir their soul. The choice is yours. If you can't do both, though. You can't manipulate them and inspire them. You can't coerce them and tell them the truth. You can't make them feel safe with safe language and also provoke their or enchant their imagination. So I'm going to give you some like solid tips here related to focusing on that first 15 seconds of your language. First of all, your focus is on curiosity or invoking curiosity, not clarity. Clarity is boring in the first 15 seconds. And this is similar to what Simon Sinek talks about in Start With Why, is that most brands start with what, which is logic and literal, and it's clear. I sell cornflakes or I sell coaching, but it's boring. The second part of this is you have to break their schema. Now, this has always been true with the way the human mind works, but it's now what there's mass marketing, mass production, massively over commoditize too much of everything, too much information, too many different brands, all of that, and then globalization as well. We come into reading something, receiving some language as consumers of language with a schema. And if you do not break that schema in some form, it's really not poetry. And so there's a couple ways to do that. One is you can express a core belief that you have. Some brands do this. They share a core belief that is sort of their driving belief behind their brand, or driving value, or as I talked about in the School of Philosophy, it's almost like their statement of philosophy. It's a belief. The second thing you can do is you can say something subversive. Subversive is an interesting word because it could mean, like being a January 6er or being a rioter or something, or an anarchist. But in this case, subversive, it's just saying something that is intentionally different than what everybody else is saying in a provocative way. You could also say this is being heretical. It's extremely powerful in that first 15 seconds. The next thing you can do is you can share your mission. And this is an invitation for people to join your mission. And the missions are bold and history shaping. So this isn't a boring mission statement. This is like a real expression of what you're here to do. If you get more sophisticated, you can do what some of the great spiritual masters like Jesus and Buddha and others did, is they use parables. Now, the key here is a parable is a very short story with a spiritual meaning. So it's evocative to the soul. But be careful of using in the first 15 seconds, really in the first couple of minutes of reading your language, of using metaphors or associations, partially because it's way overdone. And then you lose that edge to it by using metaphors or associations. And then finally, you can ask a provocative question. One of my clients is a coach for men mostly. And what he asks on the homepage of his website is, what if the ache is an invitation? That's a provocative question. And you've got to, again, be looking at your intention. Are you trying to provoke introspection? Or are you trying to use a provocative question purely for the clickbait? And you got to be very aware of that. Now, what's cool is if you're tuned into your inner muse, your intuition, you'll know. Your own bullshit detector will go off, or your own I wouldn't like this. Why would I do this to somebody else? The last tool I want to give you is a bit of structure. And in the recording of this, I'm going to put this structure in the caption on LinkedIn and on YouTube, so y'all can see it if you're watching this later. And it'll also be in an article that will be out next Friday about this same topic. So there's 5 things here. One is, and these are kind of in order of importance and in order of how the brain makes a decision to continue to give attention. The first is to be original. Now, that is very, very difficult to do because of proliferation and because things have already been said. But poets do it all the time. They're able to take a concept that other people talk about and put it in original language. That is your first challenge. That takes courage. It takes a level of consciousness. It takes a level of curiosity. that can only be found in being still and listening, as I said earlier. It's very difficult to come up with original language when you're in survival mode, scarcity mode, tasking mode. So that's the first one. The second is to be direct, be very concise with your language. And to use a Buddhist saying, be the moon, not the finger pointing at the moon. Talk about the moon, not the finger pointing at the moon. And that directness, that conciseness is that is very appealing to a tired mind. And there's a saying in journalism or business writing called bluff, bottom line up front. Similar concept of being direct in your tone, in your language, being concise, being compact. You should be able to, when you use direct language, it should feel sometimes even a little bit like a command, but it's a command not for attention, but a command for people to listen and continue to absorb what you're saying. Thirdly is to be bold. Now, some brands will do this part first, but you can be bold and unoriginal and not direct at all. It can still be bold. So I look at boldness as almost like a polishing, a refining. I mentioned that brand language, brand poetry is about refining and polishing, the marble and chipping away and getting it just right. And so if your first pass is to find the marble of originality, your second pass is to decide what you're going to create. That's the direct part. And, so it's very clear. And then bold is moving through and creating all that refinement. The next two are kind of when the language leaves you and goes out into the world. And really, it needs these original, direct, bold, but it's working when it's evocative. As I said earlier about a limbic response, you have to feel it. You have to feel the emotions of what you're saying. You have to be believable. And what's interesting about that is evocative language actually increases neurocoupling, which is, the fancy word for trust or engagement, you could say, because it's emotional and it's almost always positive emotion. That's partially because in the Bernays model of manipulation, you're using fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and insecurities, and shame, and all stuff that's low consciousness behavior and low consciousness thinking. So it's evocative of something positive like delight or joy or imagination or purpose, things like that. And then finally, it has to be motivating. Meaning there has to be some sort of call to action, something that is a request of the customer. It closes the reciprocity loop. So you have given them something that they paid attention to that has stirred them, and they need to give you something back. And that something back could be join your mail list or book a call with you or whatever your thing is. And it closing that loop creates the kind of the end of the poem. In especially on like homepage copy. So I thought it would be appropriate to end the discussion. And again, I will put this in the caption or in the descriptor of this in the video. But I want to read a short poem to you by one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver. And as you listen to this poem, think about what I said about original, direct, bold, evocative, motivating. So this isn't brand poetry, it's poetry, but it is such a great example of what I'm talking about. So this is Mary Oliver's poem, Wild Geese. She says, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes. over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. And meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Wherever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. It calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Whew, talk about goosebumps. Imagine being able to write like that for your brand. Now, I hope you found this useful. I will also say, I hope you don't find it so useful that you don't need me. Is if you want to work on this on your brand, I can do this with you. It's usually done in one day. We do the brand language in one day, and then you really can get into implementation. So if you're watching this and you're part of a team, or you have a larger company, I really want the executive team to be there, even board members, because this goes back to diversity. The language of the brand starts at the highest levels of leadership, because that's where the level of consciousness is most embodied. But you could be a small business owner or a solo entrepreneur, and I can help you craft brand poetry with your words and your soul and what you want to say to the world. So thank you for listening. Thank you for considering these ideas. The next LinkedIn Live will be on March 7th at 10:30 Central Time, and that will be hosted by my partner in All the Ways, Virginia. And she's going to be talking in that one about power dynamics. And this is an ongoing discussion that she's having with the world about her new executive coaching program for women executives from traditionally marginalized groups, called the Intersectional Leader. And that one of the key components to being an intersectional leader is having a much deeper understanding of power dynamics. So you'll see more information about that. Please share this video to other people in your world that you think would find it interesting. And I'm very grateful for your time and your attention. Thank you.